when an institution shares its collections with the DPLA, what's actually being shared is only metadata. So the actual digital objects themselves are not actually being shared. So if, for example, your institution had, say, an online collection that included scanned images of photographs and diaries or letters, those scans will actually remain on your own website. It is only the metadata that we use in order to help people find those objects, only the metadata that's actually being shared with the DPLA. So that's sort of an idea to sort of keep in the back of your mind as we go through the rest of this, because sometimes I will say sharing collections, and anytime I'm saying that, I really only mean just sharing the metadata for those collections. I've been the coordinator for the Michigan Service Hub since June of 2016. I actually had a previous position at the University of Michigan Library that was involved with HathiTrust and identifying copyright of materials that were in HathiTrust. Before that, I was actually an electronic records archivist at Michigan State University for a while. I was also part of a startup, web development startup group that I started with a couple of friends of mine for a couple of years. So I've had the opportunity for these development projects to sit on both sides of the table. And way back when, I used to be a book buyer for Borders Books and Music, where I used to buy different subject areas chain-wide, including for quite a long time, political science and American history. So in a lot of different ways, I've been engaged with the written word, both in printed form and electronically. And a lot of those previous experiences really came together for this current position. And it's one of the reasons why I'm excited about it and happy to talk to fellow librarians and archivists about it. If you have any questions that come up, please feel free to put them into chat. If I can work them into my presentation, I will do that. Otherwise, I'll try to leave some time for Q&A at the very end. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have or to get back to you if I can't answer them immediately right now. So with that statement up front about the fact that the DPLA only works with metadata, one good description of what the DPLA is trying to do, a good description of it came up in a presentation that the former executive director of the DPLA, Dan Cohen, gave in 2014 when he was talking to OCLC. And he used these three elements, a portal for discovery, a platform to build upon, and a strong public option, as a more complete description of what the DPLA is and what the DPLA is trying to accomplish. And so let me kind of walk through that a little bit as a form of introduction. So as a portal for discovery, and actually I just noticed here that I have to rearrange things a little bit in order to make sure that everything still works here. Okay. So the first thing to say about the DPLA is that it is obviously a website. If you go to the URL dp.la, you will see the website there. It's the most easy thing to say about the DPLA, that it is a website. The intention of what the DPLA is, when it began back in 2013, was to provide kind of an alternative to a Google search. You know, the Google search is the thing that our patrons, researchers, students are going to be most familiar with. The problem, of course, is that when you do a Google search for any sort of a topic, you're going to get a wide range of different materials of varying quality, often without any sort of context. So what the DPLA is trying to do is provide a very Google-like experience, at least in terms of providing a very similar kind of a dialog box, which you can see at the bottom left there under the phrase wealth of knowledge. That search box there, it works as closely to Google as possible in terms of being able to take keywords that you would use to search. The big difference between Google and the DPLA, though, is when you get search results in the DPLA, you're getting materials that have been curated by museums, by archives, by libraries, by historical societies, with the sort of supportive metadata and supportive documentation around them that will help students and researchers and members of the general public get a better context and a better understanding of what they're finding. So as a portal for discovery, that's the first thing that DPLA is. In addition to that, though, and I should mention, this is actually the current DPLA website. They are getting ready to roll out a revamped version of it. It's not fully functional now. You can see it in a beta version right now. There are a lot of features that still need to be added to it. But if you want to get a brief glimpse of the future, this is a place where you can take a look and see it. The other notable thing about it is, of course, that number there right at the very top of the new screen. They are now being able to, the DPLA now has over 20 million images included in it. And so when you do a search, you really are accessing a very large number of records and getting some very good search results as a result. Now, the second element that Dan pointed out was it is also a platform to build upon. The DPLA from the very beginning has been strongly committed to open source software and open access as much as possible. And so while you will find materials in the DPLA that are under various forms of copyright, there's always an emphasis on trying to provide materials that are in the public domain as much as possible, or even in the case of the copyrighted materials, materials that are going to be under fair use in terms of educational purposes and the other purposes that things can be used under fair use. And that commitment to openness makes it possible for people to, for example, access the metadata that has been aggregated by the DPLA and put it to other purposes. And one of the more fun results of this is that people have taken this metadata and remixed it in different kinds of ways in order to create tools that could get at these collections in interesting new ways. So some of these are very serious attempts at trying to create new web resources. Most of these apps, by the way, are both for desktop or laptop. So there is one notable app that is available for use on phones, which I'll talk about in a bit. Most of these, like I say, are intended to be research topics as well, but some of them are a bit more fun. One app in particular allows you to identify historical cats, because, of course, that's a very important thing for researchers anywhere. And so some are fun, some are more serious. There's just a range of different apps that have been created using this metadata aggregated by the DPLA. And so also on that website, you will find an apps page, and I encourage you to check it out and explore it a little bit. And you get a better sense of the potential that the DPLA provides in terms of providing an open platform for discovery and for innovation. Now, one of the reasons why it's able to do this has to do with the third element that Dan Cohen referred to, which was that the DPLA is a strong public option. As librarians and archivists, we know that we're living in an age of the internet when increasingly large proprietary platforms are dominating people's experience online. And what the DPLA is very consciously trying to do is provide a very library, museum, archive-focused alternative to that. And the way that this is able to happen through the use of metadata is the DPLA established from the very beginning a strong encouragement, or really even in their case a requirement, that the metadata for collections should be shared on the basis of it being in the public domain. So again, to make sure a clarification here, the digital objects themselves for your collections remain on your website and are subject to whatever rights statements or rights conditions are subject to those materials. What the DPLA is encouraging is the metadata that we use in order to find those collections should be in the public domain so that it can be as freely shared as possible, and that it opens up to the greatest extent the possibility to use that metadata, to remix it in ways that are going to make research possible in new and innovative ways. So those three elements together give you maybe a better, fuller sense of what the DPLA's mission is trying to be. So we got one question here. Julie, you're correct. Yes, so I'll go into a little bit more detail about this, but yes, in effect, what the DPLA is doing is using the website to link to your institution's website, and I'll show you how that works in just a bit. Okay, so having talked about those elements, let me move on a bit. The DPLA staff itself is a very small number of people. They have offices in the Boston Public Library, but they are actually scattered over quite a wide range. One of their employees actually works in Pittsburgh, another one works in Virginia, and one of them, in fact, actually lives in Saline, Michigan, about 20 minutes southwest of where I am sitting right now. And so they actually have a very 21st century orientation in terms of being very widely distributed. But despite that, we really are talking about a very small number of people, and if you think about it, even in the age of the internet, where great things can be accomplished by small groups, it would be asking a lot of such a small staff to be able to establish a one-to-one relationship with the thousands of different cultural institutions that are across the U.S. So if they were going to actually aggregate all the metadata of all these collections, they needed to find some kind of a network that would allow them to actually project their power much better than they would be able to do if it was just all being handled within their own office. And that's where the idea for the hub network came from. Now, there are two kinds of hubs that work with the DPLA. There are content hubs and there are service hubs. Content hubs are very large institutions that in and of themselves can share at least 200,000, and these days actually closer to 250,000 records just on their own basis. So we're talking about, say, the New York Public Library. In Michigan, HathiTrust would be an example. These very large institutions that have many, many records in and of themselves. And they also have the expertise of metadata and the technical support necessary to make it reasonable for the DPLA to work with them directly. So this is a small subset of very large institutions that the DPLA has a one-to-one relationship with. But for all the other institutions across the U.S., they created a set of, well, they're in the process of helping to create a set of what are called service hubs. And this is what the Michigan Service Hub is here in our state. The service hubs act as intermediaries between all the cultural institutions in a given state on the one hand and the DPLA on the other. And so in the case of the Michigan Service Hub, we're working with all the libraries, archives, museums, historical societies in Michigan, working with them and helping them prepare their metadata or to map their metadata over to what the DPLA uses. And then we work with the DPLA directly to provide the DPLA with just one point of contact for the entire state. And so that simplifies things and makes it possible for the small staff of the DPLA to actually have a nationwide reach. Okay, so the content hubs, this is a list of all of them, and as you can see, it's a pretty impressive list. As I mentioned, HathiTrust is the one that's located here in Michigan, but if you're wondering where those 20 million records in DPLA came from, you can see that the content hubs get you quite far away to that number. And these institutions also provide a lot of technical support, and they also are helping to provide all sorts of research projects and innovative ideas in order to help keep the DPLA always moving forward, always coming up with new ideas. In terms of the service hubs, this is a map that the DPLA provided in late December of last year, so we're about 2 or 3 months past it. This is about as up to date as I have, and it kind of shows you where things stand at the moment. All of you fellow Michiganders will be pleased to know that we got up and running before Ohio. I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, so I'm allowed to say that, but not that I'm encouraging competition. I'm just pointing that out. But we also have, about half the states that are orange, up and running, actively sharing records, and several other states that are in the process of actually developing their own service hubs. There is still hope that probably by the end of this year, most of those states that are currently gray will begin to be filled in. At least they'll have some sort of a service hub under development. So we should be seeing toward the end of this year most of the rest of the U.S. actually filled in. And by the way, this might be a good point to actually interject. When we're talking about records in the DPLA, they are not necessarily collections only pertaining to the U.S. Again, to quote Dan Cohen, the DPLA is trying to reflect the full sum of human experience. So you will find collections in the DPLA that relate to topics all around the world. The connecting feature is they are collections that are hosted at American institutions. So that's a distinction. One exception to that is down there around Florida. There is actually a Caribbean service hub, very early stages, but that will eventually, we hope, provide access to documents from several nations down there. So that will actually have sort of an international scope down off the coast of Florida with some of the various island nations. But as you can imagine, there are various rights issues concerned with that make that very complex. So at some point that will become an additional resource to the DPLA, but otherwise we're talking about institutions within the U.S. that have collections that pertain to topics around the entire world. Okay. So if you go to dp.la and you take a look at the website itself, I showed you the front page before. This is what you would actually get if you did a search. And specifically, this is the page that you would see if you search for all the records that have been provided so far by the Michigan Service Hub. And as you can see, as of last January, we crossed the 200,000 mark. So we're sharing over 200,000 records from collections from several institutions throughout the state of Michigan. And at this point now, we're actually on a very regular schedule at the DPLA. So every January, every April, every July, and every October, we have another what's called metadata harvest. And the harvest simply means we assemble all the metadata that we've collected up to that point, and then we work on an arrangement with the DPLA where they can harvest that metadata in order to bring it into their website and make it possible, make it searchable through their website. And so because we're on a regular quarterly schedule with them, it gives us a lot of flexibility in working with institutions. So if you're thinking about your own collections, it's not necessarily a one-stop, one-time thing. You could start off with maybe 1 or 2 collections in order to just sort of test the process. Or if you know that you're in a process of, say, revising your metadata or improving it, or if you're adding new collections, that's fine. We can always include those collections at a later date, or we can reharvest a collection if you've been able to make some changes or additions to your metadata. So we're very flexible about that, and we can do a lot of follow-up. Okay, so to give an example of how a search would go, if you're looking at Michigan collections, and if, for instance, you had an interest in women's fencing as a sport, you would actually find a couple of images in the search results. So I'm not going to give you a live demonstration because I don't trust live demonstrations, but I'm going to try to replicate that as closely as I can. So if you look at this, you'll see on the right side here, we have a column that's where the search results are. You see a title. You see a brief description of the item, a thumbnail image of the item, and then you see an orange underneath each particular result, get full image from the contributing institution. On the left-hand side, you see a series of links that will allow you to refine your search. And you can see that subject, language, these refinements are being provided through the actual metadata provided for each of those objects by the contributing institution. So the more complete your metadata is, the more granular it is, the better the DPLA can provide search keywords in order to help people find those particular objects. Okay, so let's say we were going to take a look at that second, the bottom object there, and let's say I would click on that title link there of Women's Fencing in Barber Gymnasium, circa 1903. If you did that, you would then get this page. So this is a more complete page showing a more detailed list of the metadata provided by the Bentley Historical Library for this particular photograph. Now, at the moment, we're still on the DPLA website. But let's say that we wanted to take an actual look at that object. And so we were to click on that orange link right beneath the photograph of get full image. If you were to click on that link, look what happens. Once you click on that link, you will actually switch over from the DPLA website to the website of the Bentley Historical Library themselves. And that is where you can see the full image. There may be other materials, other additional metadata provided by the Bentley as a result of this. So the point here is that when you do an initial search on the DPLA, you get a series of search results from all sorts of contributing institutions, all sorts of collections. But anybody who's looking at a particular item closely will actually switch over from the DPLA to the website of the contributing institution. The good thing about that, of course, is that your institution gets the benefit of the additional web traffic. So you get the added visibility of being part of the DPLA, but any of the interest generated from that higher visibility you get the credit for that in terms of more activity for your website. So it's a bit of a win-win situation, which I think is a very smart way to set this up. Rochester Hills has, yes, that's a very good question. At the moment, because we have a small number of institutions, it's easy enough for just to contact you. As a general rule, if you are, I'll show you a little bit about how an individual institution can work with the Michigan Service Hub. But if you stay in touch with us, and if you make it possible for us to refresh our own records of your metadata, we will always update the DPLA. And since we're doing that on a quarterly basis, it's very easy for us to do a refresh of your metadata 4 times a year. So and we're happy to do that. And I think we'll be able to continue to do that well into the future, even as we begin to scale up with more institutions. Okay. Some other elements about the website, DPLA website, that are worth mentioning is possible for users to create their own profile. This is great for helping them keep track of the research that they've done. If they find an interesting record they want to keep track of, if they want to build their own small collections in order to work on a particular project, they're able to do this. This, of course, is a free service. All they simply have to do is just log in and give them a password. And this allows them to actually sort of keep track of their own materials over time. There are also a couple other tools that are provided by the DPLA for searching for records in different kinds of ways. One of these is a map that's provided. You can start off with a map of the U.S. and then zero in on a particular community. In this case here, we're looking at Marquette, Michigan. If you're looking for records whose metadata indicated that they were associated somehow with Marquette, Michigan, they would turn up in this search. And you could see the subject codes or locations within that that would allow you to focus in a bit more. So a geographic search is possible through time, or through space, but you can also search through time. So again, metadata for records that indicate an association with a particular year allow you to do a search by year. And so in this case, still looking at Marquette, Michigan, here are records in the DPLA that are associated with particular years. The longer those pale blue bars are, the more records in Marquette, Michigan that are associated with that particular year. And you can then search through this to identify particular collections or particular items that are associated with that particular year. So you can search through geographically, you can also search through time. And obviously, again, to make the point, the more complete the metadata, the better that search will be. Now, as far as the metadata itself goes, because it's being shared in the public domain, the DPLA is able to make that metadata available to people so that they can download. So the metadata that has been provided by the various institutions is available for download in the form of JSON files. And this is, when I was showing you those apps before, this is how people were able to create those apps using the metadata provided by the DPLA. So if you go to this particular page on the website, you'll be able to find all of the metadata that's been collected so far, first divided by year, and then if you click into the year, you'll go into each state, and then through each state to each institution. And this allows, we hope, a lot of research in terms of working with big data, working with metadata in different kinds of ways. I think there's a great potential here. And I think, well, actually, let me show you a couple of examples of what has been done already and maybe give you a better idea of what the possibilities are here. So I mentioned that the apps that have been created for the DPLA, for the most part, are text, desktop and laptop based. But there is one notable exception to that, and that is Woodmobile. Now, this was actually created by the University of Freiburg in Europe, but it provides access to the DPLA records. The reason it's able to do that is the DPLA was inspired by a similar project in Europe called Europeana. Europeana is doing for European collections much like what DPLA is doing for American collections. And that made it possible for the University of Freiburg to create this tool that allows you to search both of these vast metadata aggregations, search them both together. So the next time you're stuck in the Secretary of State office waiting for your driver's license, you can pull out your phone and search all of these European collections and all these American collections all at the same time. And this is possible because that metadata has been shared, and so the app developer was able to use it in order to facilitate that search. Then there are a couple of other interesting apps that were created that are a little unexpected, and I think have some unexpected positive consequences that I think I'm hoping will be explored further in the future. And one of these is this particular app called Color Browse. And what Color Browse allows you to do is it allows you to search DPLA records by color. Now, if you think about that for a bit, that's kind of interesting because we don't really include color as part of the metadata in most collections that we share. What this particular app is doing is it's using an additional tool that is able to look at images and identify colors in those images. But then Chad Nelson, the developer, took that tool, matched it with the DPLA metadata, and it allows you to search for DPLA records by color. Now, that's sort of just a little oddity, I suppose. If you're trying to match a wallpaper on your laptop, maybe that might have some particular utility. But in playing around with it a little bit, I found an unexpected result. There was a particular shade of blue that when I searched for it, gave me this result. Now, when Chad Nelson was creating this app, I'm quite sure he didn't intend to create an app that allowed you to identify blueprints in the DPLA, but it looks like that's actually what he's done. Because when you look for that particular shade of blue, a lot of the results that you get are actually blueprints. So I share this with you as an example of the possibilities that may emerge as a result of sharing metadata in the way that the DPLA does. I think as we see more people work with this metadata and experiment with it, we may find some unexpected tools that allow us to do searches of records in some very innovative kinds of ways. So I'm looking forward to seeing what else may come out of that app page in the years to come. Some other things that are provided by the DPLA, something that you probably would expect, they do provide online exhibitions. These work very much like online exhibitions at libraries, archives, and museums elsewhere. But in this case, with the DPLA, they can draw on collections from all these different contributing institutions across the U.S. and put them into various contexts, adding contextual material, making interesting connections between materials from different collections, and providing really great resources for people who are doing research projects or maybe students looking to learn more about a particular topic. In addition to that, a really exciting development that the DPLA has been working on is something called primary source sets. So primary source sets start off with the same idea of an exhibit, but they add, through working with educators, they add additional teaching tools that make it as easy as possible to use DPLA materials in the classroom. So if you look at this page here at the upper right, there is a teaching guide. If you click on the link there, you're brought to a series of discussion questions and suggestions for classroom activities. So the focus here can be K through 12, it can be high school, it can be adult continuing education. But I think there's a tremendous potential here for helping young people and continuing ed students work with the DPLA and learn about the DPLA in some innovative ways. And I'm happy to say that they do not yet have an exhibition for the history of the automobile, for example. So I think there's a great potential for the state of Michigan to take a real role in sharing our collections and really adding some interesting exhibits and adding some interesting primary source sets to the DPLA website to the benefit of everyone, not only students in our state. I'm happy to say that a project going on right now at Wayne State University is actually going to result in the first creation of some primary source sets. But I encourage you, if you have collections in your institution that might pertain to either an interesting exhibit or a primary source set, I would love to hear about that. I'm assembling a collection now, and I'm starting to talk to the DPLA about adding Michigan collections to exhibits online. So if you have some thoughts about it, please feel free to email me about it. I would love to follow up with you about that. Okay, I can say all this, of course, because Michigan has a tremendously rich heritage, and we're very fortunate in terms of the things that have happened and that have been significant not only for the history of our state, but for the history of the entire U.S. And so we have a lot of that reflected in our collections, and so it gives us a lot of rich materials to draw from. And so that's one of the great things about being a coordinator for the Michigan Service Hub in particular. But since I've talked a lot about the DPLA, let me talk a little bit more about the Michigan Service Hub itself and what it's trying to do. So as I described the service hubs in general, the job of the Michigan Service Hub is to work with cultural institutions throughout the state of Michigan. So a part of my job is traveling around the state, which I did quite a bit of last year. Went up to the University of the Upper Peninsula a couple of times, and I'm hoping to travel around the state more, especially the western part of the state. I'm very much not focused only at Ann Arbor. I'm very much about trying to get out and try to meet people. And I'm happy to come talk to your institution, give this presentation in a modified form for anybody who would be interested, and sort of spread the word as much as I possibly can. The Service Hub started in the summer of 2015. It was brought together as a memorandum of understanding through 6 institutions: the Library of Michigan, the Midwest Collaborative for Library Services, and 4 what are called sub-hubs. These were 4 universities: the University of Michigan, Wayne State, Michigan State, and Western Michigan. And the role of the sub-hubs was to sort of distribute the work of the Service Hub. So some service hubs in some states are really very tightly centralized. It's one staff in one particular area, and they basically do it all. So, for example, Minnesota, very tightly focused because they've had a Minnesota digital library since the early aughts. And so they very naturally assumed the role of a service hub for their state, and it's very tightly focused. We here in Michigan, because we have several different institutions that have a lot of distributed expertise, we decided to take a more open approach and include more members in the process. And so each of the 4 universities not only can provide their own collections to share with the DPLA, but they also can provide technical support and metadata expertise that can be shared together through all of us in the Michigan Service Hub, and so that we can all work together and work with different institutions throughout the state in a more regional sort of a way. If you notice, all of those institutions are sort of in the southern part of the state. We're very hopeful that we'll be able to add and perhaps a university from the upper part of the state as well, in sort of to get a broader reach. We've been working on that, and we have some hopes that that will come together, if not soon, certainly within the foreseeable future. The Midwest Collaborative for Library Services acts as a fiscal agent, and so, though I'm based at the University of Michigan, in a sense, the funds for my position actually come through the MCLS, and the Library of Michigan acts as project leader. So the advisory committee that oversees the work of the Michigan Service Hub is composed of representatives from each of those institutions. So, I regularly am in contact with Randy Riley and Randy Dykheis and the other people who are on the advisory committee, and they help provide me with guidance and suggestions in terms of, ways forward for the Michigan Service Hub. And we also have a series of committees that help work out the different elements of what we need to do in order to share collections with the DPLA. And in particular, a metadata committee that I'm very fortunate to have working with me that will work directly with each of the institutions that are working with us and help provide guidance in terms of how to map whatever institution, whatever their metadata is, mapping that schema over to what we use in the Michigan Service Hub. That process, by the way, is complicated, and this is not a great diagram, but it's the closest I've been able to get in terms of trying to describe how this actually works. So as I mentioned, we're on a quarterly schedule now with the DPLA. Every January, every April, every July, every October, we share more metadata with the DPLA. And the way that works is, if you look on the left-hand side there, each of these cultural institutions scattered throughout the state, what we do is after the initial contact and after I talk to them, usually I'm the first point of contact, and so I walk them through the process and explain to them a lot of what I've been explaining to you now. What I then do is I put the institution's liaison in touch with a member of our metadata committee. And that particular member of the metadata committee will work with them, identify what metadata they're using. Are they using something that's homegrown? Are they, hosting their collections, say, in Omeka or perhaps in Past Perfect or Luna or whatever system they may be using? Identify the fields that they use for their metadata, and then match that up with the mods profile that we use here in the Michigan Service Hub. As much as possible, the metadata committee member is going to try to do the heavy lifting. We are mindful of the fact that cultural institutions often have limited budgets and limited resources. We are absolutely not asking any cultural institution to change their metadata. It's usually the way it is for good reason. What we're trying to do is take that metadata as is and match it as best as possible over to what the DPLA needs in order to make it searchable on their website. And so we want to make that process as simple and as easy for you as possible. If that actually makes it, provides motivation or whatever that you want to go back and revisit your own metadata and make improvements on it, or if you happen to be fortunate enough to get a grant in order to improve it, that's wonderful. And if you do make any improvements, we're happy to work with you on that as much as we can. And if you do make those changes, we can then come back and re-harvest those collections with the improved metadata, and the DPLA knows how to handle that as well. So we're able to sort of track those improvements as we go along as well. Anyway, the upshot is that we end up with, we use this tool called Repox at the moment, which is a metadata aggregation tool. So it allows us to bring in all the metadata from the various institutions. We can then transform it over to the mods profile that we use. And then the last step is taken on by me. I then pull all the metadata from the Repox instances at the other institutions and bring them all at the Repox instance at the University of Michigan. The simple version of that basically is, it means that the DPLA only has to contact the University of Michigan in order to harvest all that metadata. So that instead of having to deal with many, many different institutions in the state of Michigan, the DPLA is able to harvest everything just from us at U of M, one point of contact. And the DPLA is doing the same at all these other states around the union, and this makes it much simpler for them because they only have to deal with the service hubs, one point of contact, as opposed to all the different institutions within a given state. Okay. So if that raises some questions about how could you prepare in order to work with us, again, we're very much not trying to make you change anything that you do, but if you're in a position to actually make some changes, or if you're kind of curious about, maybe you're thinking about this sort of thing already. These are some of the questions we tend to ask just to sort of get a sense of where a cultural institution is. And these questions are sort of like the bare minimum of what's involved with trying to share collections with DPLA. So, for example, your digital collections need to be publicly accessible, obviously. Are there thumbnail images for each of the digital objects? Are there direct links for each digital object in the collection? That is a particular sticking point sometimes for archives, because, of course, archives are accustomed to dealing with finding aids and dealing on the collection level as opposed to individual items. This is an issue that the DPLA is very aware of. They have a working group that's trying to address it, and many archivists are actually trying to work with the DPLA in order to figure out how can we find a decent compromise between this sort of this attempt to try to emulate Google, what the general public is most familiar with, which is very much focused on the item level in terms of search results. Is there a way to sort of match that user experience with the archival reliance on finding aids? Don't have quite an answer for that yet, but they're working on it, and my hope is that they'll get there. But even archives tend to have things like online exhibits, and that may be a way for an archive to actually participate with the DPLA, even if the collections that are focused on finding aids, we can't quite get there yet. Very important question, do you have the right to share your collections online? Right statements are obviously a very important focus, and that speaks to the sharing your metadata or CC0 license, what's called a public domain dedication in the Creative Commons licensing. That's a very important thing because that's a requirement that is one requirement that DPLA asks for. Another consideration to keep in mind is, can your metadata be understood in a nationwide context? You can see, it would be very easy to see how, say, a historical society may have metadata that refers to Main Street because it makes sense within their community, but of course there are many main streets across the U.S. So this becomes an issue in terms of trying to provide this metadata in a broader context. It's not a deal breaker, but in terms of being able to help people find your collections, the more specific you can be within a nationwide context, the better it's going to be, the easier it's going to be to find your collections. And then using metadata fields consistently across collections, same kind of idea, to sort of make it easier for people to find your particular collections. That mods profile we use, as I said before, the metadata committee is going to work to try to match whatever you're using to what we use. But if you're curious about the sort of things where we are looking for, we really try to keep it as minimal as possible. The required fields are really just the bare minimum of what we need. We do need to have a title. We need to have some kind of a right statement for each image, a photograph or what have you. The data provider, what is the institute, what's the name of your institution, where's the record coming from, a direct link to that particular object, and then a thumbnail image. Even the thumbnail image is somewhat, it's something we strongly encourage, really, but it is something we can be somewhat flexible on. The DPLA has sort of a generic image that they can apply to an image, so while that's not ideal in terms of findability, if you don't actually have specific thumbnail images for every record, that's not necessarily a deal breaker. We can work with that. And then these other highly recommended and recommended fields, the reason we include those is, obviously, as I was saying before, the more granular, the more specific your metadata is, the easier it's going to be for people to search for it in the DPLA. And now, almost to close, a quick comment about copyright. This may look like just an interesting display of colors. This is actually kind of terrifying for any copyright lawyer or copyright specialist who knows about the DPLA. This image here is a result of a study that was done of the most accessed records in the DPLA about a couple of years ago, about 100,000 of the records. So the DPLA is up to about 20 million records now. This is only about 100,000. But each one of these boxes represents a different right statement associated with a particular object. The number of right statements that meet Creative Commons licensing standards, the sort of right statement that's very clear, easy to understand, that's in the small blue box there at the upper left. The orange box right beneath it, which weirdly enough has this odd green box in it, which I've never been able to understand why that appears there, that represents works that are in copyright. In most cases, nearly all cases that I've seen, even though those items are in copyright, they are, the right statement does specify that they can be used for purposes under fair use. So educational, non-commercial uses are perfectly fine, which of course is the use that most people use in DPLA would put them to. So classroom use, for example, would be perfectly fine. But then you have the other two sections. The middle section is described as no known copyright, which the more you know about copyright, the more cunning that particular description will be. But obviously that's an area that still needs to be worked on. And then there's the large orange section, which is copyright unknown. Now, if you're familiar with rights statements in your own collections, you know that this is a very complicated issue. And obviously a lot of work needs to be done on rights issues by all of us. But it emphasizes the importance when we're telling people to work with records in DPLA. Every single record, as you see there in that red box there, every single record has a rights statement. And so it's a good idea to encourage researchers and students to get in the habit of looking at that rights statement and make sure that whatever use they want to put that record to is going to be appropriate given the rights statement. It's also, I think, a point of confidence for contributing institutions to know that their DPLA is very aware of that and wants to make sure to be in compliance with copyright wherever possible. So it's a good habit to include, and we certainly want to encourage it. But all those different rights statements there, I mean, there are hundreds of different kinds of rights statements. Some of them are better written than others, do constitute a problem for the DPLA and, of course, for all of us as institutions. And so a couple of years ago, the DPLA got involved in a project called rightstatements.org. The idea of rightstatements.org is it's trying to provide a complement to Creative Commons licensing. Creative Commons licensing is very helpful, but the focus of those licenses is on individuals, not institutions. And so what rightstatements.org tries to do is it provides 12 statements that can be used by institutions. These statements are not licenses themselves, but they work alongside Creative Commons licenses, and they add further information for potential users about how those records work or what purposes those records can be put to within the context of the institution. The hope of this is that over a period of years to come, because it's going to take years to fix this, that people will be able to start to use these rights statements in their rights statements for their own collections, and in that sense start to standardize the language that we use to describe our collections and to make them available online. So I strongly encourage you to take a look at that website. They have a lot of documentation there. They really explain what they've done and why they're doing it and where they hope to go with it. And I think this is going to become something that's going to be valuable not only within the DPLA environment, but it's going to be valuable for us as cultural institutions altogether. Okay, so what's ahead for us? At the moment, the tech support team, the primary tech support team for the Michigan Service Hub is actually at Wayne State. And the Wayne State team has actually just finished work on a tool that they're calling Combine. Now, I've mentioned this tool called Repox, which allows us to work with metadata and aggregate it in one place. It's not a very good tool. It's the best one that's out there at the moment, but there's not really great documentation for it. It's very difficult to use. It doesn't really allow you to do analysis of the metadata you've collected. And so we've been trying to build a better mousetrap. And the Wayne State team has done amazing work in the last few months to pull together a prototype for it. We don't really have a front end for it, so I can't really show you much about it in this slide, but I'm hoping over the course of next year I will have something to show for it, because the Wayne State team has sort of finished their initial stage of development, and now a team at the University of Michigan is going to pick up the baton and provide a front end for it. So the two universities are working together in order to build this tool. And the nice thing about it is we've been working on it with the DPLA themselves, with their own tech people. And so there's good hope that when we build this, it's something that not only will be a great benefit to those of us here in Michigan, but it may also be a tool that other service hubs in other states will also pick up as well. The nice thing about this job is that Michigan is actually able to take a fairly prominent role within the DPLA community, and that will help us. The more we can raise our own visibility, the more resources we can get that will be sort of thinking of our needs, not only as teachers, students, all of our potential users. And so this is one important tool that we're providing for ourselves, but also for other service hubs as well. The next phase, as the work on Combine moves over to the University of Michigan, Wayne State's now going to focus on a portal. Now, the portal is going to be an online resource that will be sort of a complement to the DPLA. We're still, of course, going to share metadata with the DPLA, but we want to also have a sort of Michigan-based complement to it as well. So this would be a resource that could be searched, that would allow search for the metadata we're collecting here in Michigan, but it will allow us to actually add more material that might be of particular interest to people in Michigan, teachers, students, researchers. And so we hope to build that over the course of the next couple of years, and that will be an additional resource here. And eventually down the road, we hope to provide a repository behind that portal that will be able to support not only metadata, but also digital objects themselves. So the thinking here is particularly for, say, smaller institutions that may have a web presence now, but may not have necessarily the resources to ensure that web presence over the long term. We're hoping to provide a service for them that we can host not only their metadata, but maybe also at least a backup for the digital objects as well, and provide a more reliable source, and not only provide good metadata for it, but also follow good digital preservation practices as well, and provide an ongoing resource that other states such as Minnesota have had for quite a while. This also will allow us to actually reach back to some older digitization projects in the state of Michigan and actually bring them into this as well. So if you're familiar with some of the projects that have been done in the past in terms of digitization that have kind of run their course, still out there as resources but haven't really been added to, we're hoping to sort of draw them into the Michigan Service Hub and start to add to them as well. The other side of what we're hoping in the future is to provide services for contributing institutions. The Metadata Committee is already acting as sort of metadata consultants in some respects, but we're hoping to make that maybe a bit more robust. I would love to see us be able to provide digitization resources in order to digitize more records as we go along. And then, as I mentioned with the repository, we're hoping to sort of add more hosting as we go. These services are still in the future, but I think that there's certainly something that the advisory committee has been thinking about for some time, and I think it's something that we may be able to provide, I hope, in the near future. So that is what I hope is a good introduction to what the Michigan Service Hub is trying to do, what the DPLA is trying to do. You can reach me at rcadler@umich.edu. Would love to hear from all of you. I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. If you have collections that you think would be good to share, please feel free to contact me. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk to you today. So yes, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Or re-ask if I didn't fully answer your questions.
This is Cheryl. If you want to ask a question, you can go to the chat and ask a question, or you can individually unmute yourself. It gets a little crazy if everybody does it at the same time, but we can try.
Oh, thank you.
You did a great job of covering everything, apparently. No questions?
Great.
Yes,
Great.
It was fascinating.
And yeah, if I can clarify anything for you in the future, if you talk to colleagues and other questions come up, like I say, please feel free to contact me. Happy to talk to you. And I'm always happy to arrange an on-site visit wherever you might be to give this presentation to your colleagues if you think others would be interested, and to follow up with something a bit more specific for your particular institution as well.
Well, Richard, I am so pleased that you gave us this presentation today. We have recorded it. I forgot to start recording it before I introduced you, unfortunately, but we do have the lion's share of your presentation that we'll be able to post.
Very good.
And I don't see any questions, so I guess we can be done. So thank you so much for your time today.
Okay. Well, thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, all of you who were able to join us today.
All righty. Signing off then.
All right.
Bye-bye.